You're listening to Trending with Timmery, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmery Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmery holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmery.
Sex education and more sex education. We're seeing major changes. New Jersey is the second state to implement a law mandating LGBTQ curriculum. Here in California, where I hail from, we have seen kindergartners being forced to be exposed to the LGBTQ agenda. Why does it matter? Marriages are on the decline. Census data actually is showing that there has been a major fall in the number of kids here in the United States. Marriages are breaking. We have an increase in loneliness. We have an increase in mental health issues, sexually transmitted diseases. I could go on and on. Why does the Catholic Church care so much about this? To join me today is Dr. Philip Chavez of the Men's Academy, who is an expert in character formation, but also has done a tremendous amount of work, including your dissertation surrounding the topic of sex education and the responsibility of parents.
Exactly. Which, it is primal as well as the education of the entire child in all subjects.
Absolutely. So coming up, we're going to be talking a lot about sex education, who should be doing it, what are the curriculums and resources out there, and maybe, a better idea of what's actually happening in the curriculum. And they're so scandalous, you guys. I had to turn off my screen and just listen, and I was cringing as I was listening to some of these videos that are being implemented for high school students and middle age, you name it.
That's right. And and for those even up to the age of 22, they cover a variety of subjects. And some topics look innocuous and actually in some way beneficial. But in the end, I don't think it's really directing itself to any real cause for the church or for the good.
I want to tie this back into the whole topic of marriage right now, because fewer and fewer people are getting married. We've seen a crisis of vocations, the religious life and the priesthood. Why is that? I think because so many people, and I'd like to get your take on this, Dr. Chavez, they're mutilating either their bodies physically or how they treat their bodies. Through healthcare, we believe that hormonal contraception, our reproductive rights, people are getting vasectomies all of the time. People think that freedom is the live all be all in terms of sexuality, and so you can do whatever you want. Education has really confused the difference between maleness and femaleness, and even how the bodies interact with each other. Women and men, but especially women, are challenged with facing the idea of a career versus children, or even education versus children. Quality of life has become a huge argument, not just for the quality of life of the child, but the quality of life for me and what type of quality of life I want. So maybe I only want to have one child so that I can maintain a certain quality of life.
Sure.
Which ultimately brings us back to the idea of comfort. And unfortunately, we use the excuse of, well, maybe I'm just not ready yet.
Yeah, I think what's happening is we're now in a society that's radically individualistic. Mm-hmm. Everything is oriented toward oneself. And in order to really have a proper perspective on marriage, it has to be other-centered. And in some way, even to drill down even that, to have a proper perspective on marriage, we have to see how it is good for the society and how the society needs to be supporting it. I think the problem is we've come down now to making vocation just a personal thing and not other-centered and community-centered. And so I think that really affects a proper view of its place in society, which even drills down to some of these issues we're having with sex education, all the rest. We're not seeing these things as they're affecting society as a whole.
Absolutely. And, you touched on this idea, and we're going to talk about this in the next episode that we do together this week. We talked about how a lot of people are looking at, marriage as a personal thing, essentially.
That's right.
It's interesting because we're going to be discussing priestly celibacy. And I think the same type of idea enters in there. Well, it's personally what I want to seek after.
Yeah. With priesthood celibacy, I think we have some other issues there, too. I think, but in alliance with those who are in the priesthood and struggle with celibacy, or seminarians and those who discerning marriage and whatnot, I think some of the fundamental problems are the same. There's lack of proper human development at the earlier stages. And so the needs of the child probably weren't met individually, communally, socially, even within the family. The families are torn apart. And so I think there's so many reasons and aspects and causes for which the families break down. The person, their identity is broken down. So it's hard to raise yourself to identity as a priest or a married person if you haven't established that identity, maybe just as a son or a daughter or just as a man or a woman.
At the whole heart of the question is, who am I? What am I made for? What are my sexual desires oriented toward? These are all questions that distinctly set us apart as Catholics. And so whether it's ourselves or maybe the young people that we're responsible for, friends, family members, we need to be able to have these conversations to help other people understand this is what sets us apart as a Christian people.
That's right. And to drill that down even again, I think it's somewhat of an orientation I think people need to have, young people need to have when they're being raised, is that marriage is ordered toward procreation. And there's a glory in having children and fostering children, raising children, and having children around one's home. And so I think that glory, that center of marriage is not very well inculcated now in homes and in education. And I think that will, too, affect a man's disposition to enter the priesthood. In fact, at the same level, even a woman's disposition to enter consecrated life. Because there is something about fostering that generosity of having children and serving in that way that's fundamental and basic to a priestly or a religious vocation, my opinion.
You're listening to Trending with Timmery. That is Dr. Philip Chavez of the Men's Academy. Again, I come back to this question, why? In order for this to all stop with the sex education, it has to stop at us. We have to see that sex is a good thing. It actually relates to our happiness, both here and now in the day-to-day and in the longevity of life, but ultimately in life with Christ in heaven. Because it ultimately relates to the soul. You know, we try to separate body and soul, but the soul has an eternal destiny. That's
right. And so in light of that, Timmery, I think what you're directing yourself toward is somewhat of an argumentation or orientation to the fact that sexuality does have a purpose, and that purpose is for family, and that purpose is God ordained. And so if I think we leave out that argument to see how it is intrinsically ordered in that way, then when we come down to just parental rights or somebody's right to educate or whatnot, and all these other arguments which dissuade us or take us away from the core of the position that sexuality really is ordered toward family life, and its proper order is always aimed in that direction.
Absolutely. Well, and as you talk about purpose here, we struggle right now to have purpose in everything we do. You know, in fact, people are so stressed out. They're so overwhelmed. They don't have deep friendships anymore. Their, marriages, their relationships with family members are struggling. And I think it's because there's a lack of purpose. There's a lack essentially of intentionality.
I think that's right.
And here's a good example, I think, and it's something I really try to work on. Being intentional about what I'm working at when, so that I'm not distracted. Things such as having a time blocked off calendar has been something for me that's been so important since I've been in college, because if I don't know what I'm working on, I'm going to be distracted by anything. And so we could talk about that from the perspective of task saturation, but we can also talk about it from the perspective of our whole life and what it's oriented toward and what its purpose is.
That's right. And so for that reason, when people consider marriage, they really have to have a certain intentionality that, hey, this is inherently about building a family. Mm-hmm. And so I think some people can actually easily lose that when they make it about finances or when they make it about, the wedding dress or plans or whatnot. There's so many things that that can distract you from that kind of intentionality, to seeing how this is all oriented toward children having a family and fostering life.
Ultimately, at the heart of this, as we keep coming back to family life, marriage, there's the ability to create new life, co-create new life with God. And there's this responsibility for an immortal soul, for a child that is called to be raised up to be created for the kingdom of heaven. And if we're going to properly raise people up for the kingdom of heaven, that requires truth. That requires helping them to understand that they're a transcendent being with a greater purpose, which is why when we look at New Jersey, this is actually a really big threat. And it's not just happening in New Jersey and California, but it's already being implemented in unknowingly to many parents in the sex education of children, where literally laws are mandating or schools are taking it upon themselves to implement curriculums that give no option to opt your children out or even let you know what's being stated. And it's really providing adult level content. I mean, in fact, I was reading a quote, Dr. Chavez, by one person who was really defending the new New Jersey mandate for the LGBT curriculum. And he's saying, well, he's an adult who lives a same-sex lifestyle, and he's talking all about himself and about how he wished he had learned more about himself. And that breaks my heart because he's talking about a gay identity, not about himself as a transcendent human being.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Again, so you bring up a number of different problems here, and I think things have gone so to the effect that these people just want not just that these lifestyles be permitted, but that they even be celebrated.
Yes.
And that the intention is then, in order to get into this disposition of celebrating these kinds of deviant lifestyles, they want education to actually permeate every phase or facet of a school life. So now textbooks are being written in history and economics and grammar. Even I was told by one professor, even the language text, he teaches Spanish at a high school and college level. Even that, they're trying to inculcate transgender references in those texts.
This has been why our show here, Trending with Timmerie, has focused so much on the gender issue. I hear from people in the workforce and people in the university setting that every field of education, of every various office within wherever you might be working, this agenda is being forced. I mean, a college student can't even take a college course anymore. English, history, and math somehow without this gender ideology being forced down their throats. And so my challenge to you is, if this gentleman's talking about how he wished he learned more about himself, how are we teaching young people today about themselves?
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
As I look at the crisis over sexual education, and California has been there in the midst of it for years, and it's so fascinating to me because a lot of those parents who have said, great, my kids are learning about puberty in school, I don't have to talk about it. It's more comfortable that way. Okay, great. At least they have the kids separated, male and female. Fine, they get to discuss this. Some parents will say, I'm fine with my kids learning about their reproductive health and, how to use a condom, about sexually transmitted diseases. I'm grateful that the schools are teaching that. But now a lot of people are waking up and they're saying, no, this isn't okay. There's the example right now in California of Senate Bill 673, and this was really put together and called for by one mom who was okay with all of that until the gender ideology issue ended up being forced into the schools, and she realized, in fact, the schools aren't even letting us know that this is changing, and they're not giving us the option to opt our children out of it.
Yeah, that's really a shame. I mean, parents are being violated a number of levels. I mean, obviously the child's being violated, but the parental rights to educate their child are being overlooked. And now I'm to understand, I mean, some school districts are actually ignorant of that parents can opt out, but many are very aware. I mean, there's that one California education code, it's 51240, that does allow a child to be excused from any part of a school's instruction and health that conflicts with the religious training and beliefs or the personal moral convictions of their own parents. So that ability to opt out is there. And so sadly, parents are being misinformed about their rights.
So the Senate Bill 673 673, I might have that backward. I need to double check that one there. It's a Transparency, Equity, and Accountability Instructional Material Act. And essentially what it's doing is they're saying we need the option to opt out. We need transparency. Parents need to have the information provided to them and easily so that parents who are busy as well can at least receive the information online and decide if they want their child to or not to engage in this information. And what's interesting is they're actually only really focusing on up to about the middle school age range, because a lot of people who are even in support of this new possible legislation are still okay with, high school kids learning it all, being exposed to everything.
Interesting. The sad thing is that the school systems, the state of California, is not being forthright about what they're trying to do. And so they're taking all measures they can to hide this content from the parents. And the teachers are actually convinced that the parents really don't need to know much about the content at all. And I've heard even recently from the Murrieta School District, of which I live near, that they publicly professed that, well, parents really have no rights in education. It's really up to us, the educators, who should be dictating what the children should be learning.
It's interesting. So at the beginning of last year, actually, 2019, we learned that in the school districts, some of the school districts in San Diego, that the teachers were being brought into seminars and they were being taught by various advocates for the LGBTQ type lifestyles, that really the teachers should know that parents are essentially ill-equipped to deal with these issues. They might even have old-fashioned ideologies, might be prejudiced because of religious or moral viewpoints. And so, if a child comes and is living a certain type of alternative lifestyle with regard to their sexuality, the teacher should not inform the parents, but instead filter them into organizations and clubs that promote, and I will put this on my part, and that's not what they say, but essentially lifestyles that are incredibly risky for minors, both sexually from the level of STDs. I'm sorry, we'll get into this later, but the body doesn't work that way. You're more vulnerable for sexually transmitted diseases, both when you engage in sexual activity sooner, especially for women, because parts of the reproductive area is more sensitive to STDs, but also from a same-sex interaction level, the body's not meant to work that way. And so diseases are taking place in certain areas that leave you so vulnerable.
Yeah, that's all very tragic. And so you see how the deviation and how things are handled in terms of sexual deviation, how the deviation for proper practice and teaching and responsibility really leads to many of these problems. But the teachers inherently do have a responsibility when they see these kinds of acts on the part of children that they're teaching or leading. They do have a responsibility to confront the parents, because if there's anything a parent has a more intimate interest in the raising and education of their child, is things pertaining to sex or sexuality. And so that again, in fact, one might even argue that's even more inherent than faith on one level, because the parents are connected very intimately and directly because on the sexual level. So it behooves them to have that right and that duty to educate in that area and be responsible in that area.
Here's the reality. If we don't form ourselves and we don't help to form others, especially those who we're responsible for, nothing's going to change. We need to know what the church teaches, and we need to know what sex is for. And so it's interesting, because I have one of the episodes we did on trending where I said, well, what is sex for? It's probably one of the most popular episodes we've done. It's on YouTube as well. And people watch it all the time because they go, well, what is sex for? I mean, I know adult Catholics who have been married for years, and they still haven't quite put sex within the proper context of the church, not just their own feelings and experience of it.
That's right. And I think really that's because of an orientation that's throughout their life, which even the popes talked about, Pius XI and Pius XII, how the main orientation, the formation of a child, as Pius XII said, is form girls to be wives and mothers, and men or boys to be husbands and fathers. And so there used to be an orientation in education and development and formation to form for fatherhood and motherhood. Now it's mainly formed for the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And while in the marketplace, it's about what you want to do, what you want to pursue, what you feel is right for you. So there's such a self-orientation toward what one wants to do, and not really that orientation toward family life, and the values and the real happiness that's found there.
If we do not form ourselves in the way of the church, the way of the world is already forming us.
That's
television, right. Relationships, friendships, the brokenness and sexual relationships and marriages all around us. We need to understand what the church is teaching with regard to sexuality. And so that's part of the reason why I tend to kind of review some of what's out there. And by the way, if you're listening or just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmery. Dr. Philip Chavez of the Men's Academy is here with me. And you need to know about this. So I was looking at some of the new enhanced sex ed programs by Planned Parenthood, and I was watching and sometimes just listening. I was shocked by these programs that were meant to be for basically 16 to 22-year-olds, so in the high schools.
Sure.
And just the level of exposure focusing so much on sexual fluidity, same-sex relationships of both men and women, opposite-sex relationships, the conversations about condoms. Multiple partners. I was just so surprised by their only thing that they emphasize really is consent. And
that's right.
Consent is all that matters. And in one respect, that's something that's really important that more people do need to be equipped on. And so in a sense, props to Planned Parenthood for making sure that there's really an emphasis on making sure absolutely your partner's okay with what you're doing.
That's right, yeah.
But that's not enough.
That's right.
That's where it's a problem because they're still encouraging basically behaviors that are medically risky, spiritually risky, long-term risky for even being able to have a good emotional relationship, a marriage, good health. And there's so many risks involved in these very graphic programs that they're implementing.
Yeah, so when we think about consent, really, what does that mean? Well, my judgment consents to doing a certain action. And so that leads into what freedom is. And so that's what they want to allude. Well, if there's consent here, then everybody's acting freely and openly. But that's not really true because the consent, which should lead to freedom, really should be oriented to the true and the good. Mm-hmm. And so the freedom is only found when we're achieving the good and achieving the true. And going back to what you said earlier, yes, it's important, Timmery. Yes, Catholic parents do need to know, Christian parents need to know what the faith does teach, but they should also see that, well, the faith ultimately teaches what's already in the natural order. It's not just simply we believe in sexuality because of it's simply divinely revealed, but it's written in our human nature, which makes it intrinsically inherently wrong. And I think we need to lean on that more and more and more to see how these are really deviations from not just God's intention and commandments, but the order of nature itself. That really is our chief argument. And then that parental rights and all these other things come second. But we must see that it's inherently against the natural order.
When we talk about freedom, and I love how you kind of juxtapose freedom and consent, you talked about how freedom is for the good, and this is what we need to emphasize. Freedom is for something. It's not to run away from something. It's not a negative definition. Freedom is a positive definition that orients you toward what is good and true. And with that respect, we're also talking about how sex is essentially written into our bodies, into our nature. This is why I love doing sex education programs with youth. We can even, as Catholics, start from the premise of just how the body functions. One of the things I'll talk a lot about with young people when I'm giving a presentation, and it's amazing because a lot of people don't realize this even, and it ties into the pornography issue, that the chemicals that are released during sexual intimacy, dopamine gives that sense of pleasure high. Serotonin gives that sense of serenity. Oxytocin bonds you to another person. Creates this relationship. We have the endorphins that give us this little bit of, pleasure high, happiness, make us feel good. All of these chemicals are written into our body for when we engage in sexual intimacy, specifically for the person or for the purpose of bonding us with a particular person for life, helping us to overcome those difficulties within marital relationships and family relationships, to help provide fidelity to one another and ultimately good parents and faithful parents to children.
That's right. Parents who will stick around. And so, yes, there is so much in sexuality which is oriented toward the bonding of a parent that's so much needed in some way to be emphasized like you are right now because unless that is, then people won't see the comprehensive element that sexuality does entail, because it does involve us in terms of body, soul, our will, our emotions, and on these deep physiological levels that you're talking about.
Coming up, we'll be talking about the Nutcracker. I know we're a little past the holiday season, but why does the Nutcracker matter right now with regard to Catholic schools, Catholic education, children, and sex? We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmery.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmery.
So I've been looking at these sex ed videos by Planned Parenthood. I've been watching, some of the sex ed programs that Vice has put together in partnership with Netflix. And as we're looking at all of these programs, what stands out, and you and I know this, it's no surprise, but it's also something that we don't always do a good job speaking to, and that is that the whole focus of sexuality in the secular world is pleasure. What makes you feel good. So as long as there's consent, what is pleasurable reigns. So talk to me about this here on Trending is Dr. Philip Chavez of the Men's Academy.
Yeah, and so in this case, the pleasure, people think that this is something I want and wish, and therefore I should be free to pursue this. And so again, as we spoke about earlier, there's such a grave misuse of the word freedom. Instead of acting to the true and the good, it's more of people are looking at freedom more in terms of license, to wish to do what they wish, to lead them to something to greater pleasure. And so again, this is a deviation for what is true and the good, and eventually will, especially in the areas of sexuality, will affect a person with negative effects.
This focus on pleasure is so blatantly clear in the new Sex Explained series that's produced by Netflix and Vox together. I remember when Netflix, it used to be, we used to order the DVDs and you could get those DVDs and movies that you could never see that were so good, so pure, so just awesome stories. And now here's what they're producing. And they're talking about bondage, sexual fantasies, multiple partners. But you guys, we all know this, and the young people know this too. If only we would appeal to it. We want more. We want more than what the culture is offering. And that's why only when we have an authentic understanding of the church's teaching will we see the beauty of the love of spouses, the ability to create new life, and the purpose in living your entire life as a gift of self. And so I want to just touch for a second on those 4 goods that we talk about in marriage of being free, total, faithful, and fruitful.
That's right. Yeah, those sum up, again, what the order of sexuality really tries to aim toward. There's something about the total gift of self that nothing is held back from the individual. And certainly in marriage, you always want to know that your spouse is giving themselves completely and not part way.
Well, and think about this from the perspective of you as a child, and maybe whatever your experience was with your own parents and what you want in a relationship moving forward, kind of compare that. Think about how I want that love to be free, not to be forced, not to be manipulated. Maybe you've seen relationships that have been manipulated. This love should be freely given, because when it's freely given, it is so much better. It's good. It's joyful. And not only that, it should be total. There's nothing that is being held back. It's 100% of ourselves being given. And this is where we start to touch on the problems with, for example, condom use, not just contraception, but condom use, that barrier. There's a physical barrier between you and your partner that is saying there's not quite everything that I'm willing to give you. And my poor mother's years when I talk about this part, but when we talk about even studying sexual intimacy, and it's so interesting because I'll talk to people who have been sexually active before marriage, and they'll talk about the difference when they get married, and I'll hear from men who said, I actually never fully knew how great sex actually was because I was using various means to not completely commit to that person because I was afraid, STDs, pregnancy, all these other things that come with it, but you weren't receiving I wasn't receiving the full experience is what they would share with me. Yeah.
So in light of this, Timmery, I think just as a basic overall principle here, when things are not according to the right order, there is going to be somewhat of a frustration involved with the individual. That sense of completion, sense of wholeness that you talked about earlier, that sense of meaning is in some way lost and will manifest itself in some kind of frustration in the individual and a frustration in the relationship as well. And the difficulty is in marriages, these are often hard for couples to detect and become aware of. And so it's not until somebody actually can point out and help them see that frustration, could show them maybe the misery or the discordance that's happening in their own relationship.
Let's also talk about faithfulness. Faithfulness, I think, is something that all of us long for, that faithful and true friend who is always there by your side. Not saying that they're going to condone the imperfect and the bad and the sin and the vice, but they're going to be faithful to you in your development toward the good. They're going to be faithful to the marital relationship, to the sexual act. That fidelity that spouse has no eyes for anyone other than you. There's that fidelity. That's true love that,
right.
Hollywood tries to portray, but yet it's what the church is saying. This is what you must have.
That's right. And isn't it the case, Timmery, that I think deep down in a woman's heart is knowing that she's not going to be abandoned? Right?
For a lot of women, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that such that. So a man is to reassure the woman in his life through its sexuality is an expression that he is not going to abandon her. He will be with her in all things and at all times.
Let's talk lastly about the fruitfulness within marriage. People forget that this isn't only talking about children. We're called to be open to life, always open to the gift of life that will be given to us. But also, our marriage isn't just supposed to produce fruits in terms of creating new human beings, but in fashioning and caring for souls, the souls of the spouses for one another,
That's
of
right.
the spiritual children that come in and out of the home. I always think of my parents. They had so many friends, family members who would come in and out of their home who they really tried to foster goodness in for however long they would be there with us.
That's right. And that helps a couple bond. Again, as you say, just to expand upon what you're saying, is when they do share in this, I'll use the word project of raising children and bearing new life. When parents are able, they can grow in many things, but when they share a common enterprise or a common task, in this case, raising children, that tends to help them bond in a far deeper way. And that goes back to the purpose for which the marriage is oriented. And I think people can more easily see purpose when they're sacrificing for the sake of others.
That's Dr. Philip Chavez of the Men's Academy. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
They can learn about me at themensacademy.org.
themensacademy.org. Lots of resources, both text, they have books, they have DVDs, a podcast, so please go check it out at themensacademy.org. We want to talk a little bit about the Nutcracker. Me, for those who don't know, I grew up dancing, I think, over 17 years of very active. I think my last year of dance in high school, I was dancing close to 40 hours a week. I had the opportunity to dance with the Kirov, the Russian Ballet Company, in high school during their summer programs. And the Nutcracker is something that is near and dear to my heart, that magical fantasy world during Christmas where we get to step away for a minute to a different time, a different place, beautiful music, and be awed by the talent on stage. Yet here we are in 2020, and there's a major debate because there was a school in Toledo, Ohio, who was taking middle school kids to go and see the Nutcracker, and right before the curtains opened, one of the chaperones decided to leave, and it was because they found out that the parents of Clara in the opening party scene would be portrayed as a same-sex couple, and they decided this isn't something that we're ready to expose the kids to. Adults might be able to handle that, but kids' young minds were not going there. And it was so interesting, Dr. Chavez, I want to get your take on this, because what ended up happening is initially the account is that apparently reports say the principal supported this, and then after an alumni basically came back criticizing the entire situation about, being homophobic and not inclusive, essentially the principal came back out saying that this goes against some of their inclusion statements and non-discrimination policies and their code of ethics. And this is actually pointing essentially to a real crisis. Can Catholic schools maintain their Catholic identity, codes of conduct, in a realm where everyone's focused on this whole idea of non-discrimination?
Yeah, so this is a very wide question. There's many different facets here. First of all, the chaperones did something which was noble and right. They, according to their conscience, according to be consistent with Catholic teaching, as I understand it, took all the children out of the theater before the event even started, or before the play even started. So, of course, chaperones usually, if they're volunteering, usually they're the more responsible ones, more responsible parents. And so they acted very responsibly here. And in this way, in this respect, they made this really a teaching moment in a way to show the kids, or I hope they explain later, that no, we can't see this as improper, not according to our beliefs because of this same-sex couple. But it's sad that they weren't supported by the president, and that she herself, I would have a feeling, yes, as you mentioned, she probably advocated this in the beginning, but then later on, I think she was probably feeling for the pressure, not for this one moment on social media, but I think even the media of that area, other parents, other disgruntled alumni. And so, and then she caved in. Of course, as is wont to do, in leadership, we want to somehow keep a sense of peace or false peace. And so I think she was tempted in that area. But again, I think she should have upheld the high school beliefs, which were to uphold, the Catholic Church. And they profess that even in their own mission statement, and that they will, that they are there to uphold the teachings of the Catholic Church, that the children are to be educated accordingly. So in many ways, she acted really against their own mission statement.
These are excellent opportunities when these challenging circumstances arise. And again, maybe you wouldn't have walked out of the Nutcracker at this time. Maybe you would have stayed. Maybe you would have used it as a teaching opportunity. Maybe, the kids didn't even notice that it was a married couple in the beginning. Again, I don't know. Maybe they had him kiss. Maybe they didn't. I don't know what was going to happen there. I do know in the performing arts world, they can go too far at times or make satire out of things they shouldn't be making satire out of. But here's the reality of the opportunity to teach, whether the kids did or didn't see. We can go back to the teaching that men and women only can have babies. So the reality of them having Claire, well, there's still a mother and a father to that child, and the child should have a right to their mother and father. And we can talk about how sex really only works between a man and a woman. And if you show the body parts, cartoon versions or whatever, depending on age appropriateness, we can show it only works in this way. And when there's any deviation, it's very harmful for the bodies, especially the bodies of women. And finally, just to kind of wrap up that point of a teaching moment, God created sex for marriage, and it's meant to be unitive and procreative for the good of the spouses and for the creation of new human life. And so I'm really grateful for this article from Patrick Riley with First Things. He's the president of the Cardinal Newman Society, does an excellent explanation, and really is there defending Catholic schools and their ability to live according to what the Catholic Church teaches and to really implement this within their schools.
Timmery will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmery. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmery, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
We're living in a time where there is so much hostility to the Christian way of life. We've been talking, this week about the idea of forced sex ed programs for young people. I mean, even kindergartners. We've also been talking about this idea that, celibacy and sex within marriage, or even the idea of having, a partner of the same sex is optional, let's say for the Methodist Church and their presbyters. Yet at the same time, there's another area where we're being attacked, and that has to do with healthcare. Healthcare is a big deal here in the United States, and we're going to discuss the new decade trends in American healthcare with Bradley Hahn, co-founder and CEO of Solidarity HealthShare. Thanks for being with us, Bradley.
Yes, thank you, Timmery.
As we're looking at all of this, Solidarity HealthShare is incredible because they're a Christian nonprofit healthcare sharing ministry that actually offers an ethical and affordable alternative to traditional health insurance based on Catholic Church teachings. So just like we're talking about STDs and sexuality in the faith, we actually have to talk about our faith with regard to healthcare. So we're actually seeing coming up this new year, as we're entering a new decade, major, I think, conversation took place from 2010 on over healthcare and really moral responsibilities for Catholics. Now that debate is continuing. What can we expect to see over the next couple of years, Bradley?
Well, I think the primary concern that we're going to see in healthcare and the debate that's going to be happening is who's going to be paying for the healthcare and access to healthcare in this country. And that's what the Affordable Care Act was allegedly supposed to do, is grant greater access. But with that came some strings. And just like, on your previous segments, you're talking about how the culture is trying to influence us Christians to think the way the society and the culture does. It's the same way with healthcare. So the government's constantly telling us that, as a Christian, it's okay to violate your conscience, to pay for things we find morally objectionable, like contraception, sterilization, and abortion, and gender reassignment surgeries and the like. So that's kind of what we get bombarded with on a daily basis when it comes to health care. You may not even realize it or not. But then, that's what Solidarity HealthShare was a response to. So we're trying to find an ethical and an affordable way for faithful Christians to pay for their health care, so we don't have to pay for contraception, sterilization, abortion. So I see in the next decade that conversation is going to be even more heightened at the individual level. But we're also seeing a trend now is the employer mandate, where if you have over 50 employees, you have to offer these insurance products that contain these immoral issues. And then we're also seeing another debate that's really coming up and resurfacing a lot the last couple of years is the deliverer of healthcare, the providers of healthcare, where these faithful Catholic doctors and nurses are being forced to violate their conscience and participate in these immoral activities like prescribing contraception or assisting in abortion. And so what kind of conscience rights and protections do they have in our current healthcare system? So around the conscience piece, it's a pretty big deal when the culture tries to go through the health insurance to try to influence and basically coerce Christians to violate their conscience.
Wow, it is such a challenging time for people. I mean, even just deciding what sort of career you want to enter into. I know for so many friends of mine, they want to enter into nursing, getting involved, maybe becoming a nurse practitioner, a doctor, but even just choosing the types of medical schools you work with, or even for many people entering into interviews, and maybe they bring up that they won't prescribe or be involved with prescribing birth control. In a lot of places, at least here in San Diego and California, they almost have a door immediately shut on them. And this is why it's so great, because you guys are actually involved in discussions right now with the Trump administration on new policies surrounding healthcare and transparency rules, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the second issue, the big debate we're going to be seeing the next couple of years, not only the conscience issue, but the transparency issue. So right now, a lot of people agree that our healthcare system is broken. We have the best healthcare system in the world as far as the care comes, but how it's paid for, that's what's really flawed and broken right now. And so we've had continuous conversations with the Trump administration and Health and Human Services on transparency, because the consumer of healthcare, the providers of healthcare, and the insurance companies of healthcare, they really don't know what healthcare costs. And so that's when we come into the marketplace and our 10,000 families are out there trying to get health care. We're asking for fair and just pricing and transparency when it comes to health care. And that's the Trump administration is doing a magnificent job. They're trying to implement new rules and regulations to try to have the lower middle class in particular and the middle class in general to have affordable access to health care. And the Trump administration, just like Solidarity believes, is that transparency is a good start. So if we know exactly how much health care costs, then we can shop and be more transparent. I'll give you a classic example. Is when my son had ankle surgery, we were interviewing a couple surgeons, and one surgeon was very open to fair and just pricing, and he was willing to give our family and Solidarity members fair and just pricing. But another another doctor was going to charge us 3 times more than what the going market was in the Phoenix area. So it made our decision pretty easy. Is we wanted to go with the best doctor that's going to protect our conscience rights, that's going to do the best job for my family, but that's also going to understand that we also want a fair and reasonable price when it comes to health care.
That is excellent. I have on the phone with me right now Bradley Hahn. He's a co-founder and CEO of Solidarity HealthShare. And if you're not familiar, they're actually an alternative to traditional health insurance. They're Catholic. They have their whole focus on healthcare is centered around the Catholic Church's teaching. Your health and ethical and affordable alternative is available here with Solidarity. So right now, Brad, we're seeing that we're talking a lot about transparency and pricing, but the reality is that a lot of people have no idea what's going to be coming at them in terms of medical bills. So you guys are actually working and looking at the new trends in this upcoming decade of helping to protect patients from surprising medical bills.
Yeah, that's the big issue, too, in Congress. You're seeing this idea about surprise medical billing. So what surprise billing is when you go to the hospital and you think you're paying for X, and then all of a sudden, surprise, you get a bill for Y. Mm-hmm. That's usually very expensive. And that, again, I'm using another story with my son's ankle. After the surgery, we had to go to the emergency room because he had some complications, and they tried to bill us $4,000 for a 45-minute emergency room visit.
Wow.
And so we've been constantly battling with them saying, okay, we'll pay this, but give us an itemized bill so we know exactly what we paid for. Did we pay $100 for a box of Kleenexes, which is usually coded as a mucus collection device? Did we pay $2,000 for this doctor to come and say hi and goodbye? And so they basically sent us an itemized bill that said, Emergency room consultation, $4,000.
Wow.
And so we're like, no, this isn't going to do it. We want to know exactly what things cost. And so that's what our members do, and we help this on behalf of our members as we look at a bill. The first thing we do with that bill, we look for errors. And usually we can find about 7 to 12% reduction in that bill just based on medical billing errors. Mm-hmm. Then after that, we try to get what fair and reasonable pricing is for that local area based on what Medicare would pay, what cash would pay, what the hospital would accept from insurance carriers and such like that. And then we can determine what a fair and reasonable price is. And so that's why we're working with the Trump administration, because we would like more data, more information on what healthcare costs in this country so we can be better informed consumers.
Absolutely. And, I'm just thinking of a recent story, Bradley. Again, I'm talking with Bradley from Solidarity HealthShare. I had a family member this past summer, and they needed a heart Holter. And the heart Holter, they could not get any idea of what the heart Holter actually costs. They asked the hospital, the nurse, the doctor, the insurance company. They even asked the company that administered the Holter. No one would give a response. They finally said, you know what, things are getting better. I'm just not going to use this heart Holter because no one will actually give me any sort of idea of what this costs. And so what Solidarity is doing is you guys are being advocates, again, for that transparency, but also from a Catholic perspective to be responsibly good, essentially good stewards of what we have and how we're spending our healthcare dollars in a time when we're spending more money than ever on health insurance.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And what we've been seeing at Solidarity when members join Solidarity when they abandon traditional insurance is exactly that. So some of these families, it's very common for a family of 4, a family of 6 to have a deductible of $5,000 to $10,000 to $15,000. And most middle-class families, what I'm covering up now is that they don't even have that in their savings account right now to pay those medical expenses. And so we got much of the middle class now are foregoing and postponing routine medical care because they simply can't afford to pay it because of these high deductibles that we're seeing in insurance.
Now,
and you know that too, Timmery. When you start delaying medical care, that's only when it's going to get worse for your body.
Now, could you give a comparison with Solidarity? You guys don't have a deductible, but you call it an unshared amount that is similar to a deductible. What would those numbers be in comparison?
Yeah, like my family of 4, our monthly contribution is $549 per month. And our first $2,500 annual out-of-pocket cost, that's what we're responsible for financially. And then once the medical bills get above the $2,500 as a family, that's when they're submitted for sharing to Solidarity, and then it's shared among our members of Solidarity.
And that $2,500 isn't per visit; it's for the whole year for the family.
Correct, it's for the whole year. So
that's what you're paying past your monthly payment.
Exactly. Yeah, the monthly contributions of $549, and then we're responsible for our first $2,500 out-of-pocket costs.
Okay, so here's the question. I think this is what's really different about Solidarity in comparison to traditional health insurance. You can actually sign up anytime. Is that correct? So if someone's between jobs, maybe they're sitting here going, wow, we're expecting a child, or we're concerned we don't want to change jobs yet because, we want to make sure that we have insurance at this time. You can always sign up for health insurance through Solidarity or alternative health insurance.
Yeah, exactly right. And so that's when we get a lot of families signing up. They lose a job. And, with the Affordable Care Act, you can only enroll in an insurance, November, December timeframe, where we get a lot of families in mid-year that lose a job. Maybe they want to quit the job. Maybe they want to do an early retirement. And they look at Solidarity as a way to fund their medical expenses.
Excellent. What an awesome resource. And I love it because it's so centered on our Catholic faith, on being morally responsible, ethically responsible, fiscally responsible with how we are spending what we have been given that truly is a gift. So if you want to learn more about Solidarity HealthShare and the incredible work that Brad is doing, please go check out solidarityhealthshare.org. Again, that's solidarityhealthshare.org.
This has been Trending with Timmery. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. That's radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.